much, and I traveled with him for 5 years, the last 5 years of his life. He was a true warrior for liberty. He was a great Christian man. He was an incredible mentor to me, and it was a loss to the organization, and it was a great loss personally because he was such a close friend and mentor. And there was a spot that was just empty at Convention of States, and I remember looking around, I remember talking to Patty, and we had this conversation that spot could just never be filled. Like, I couldn't even think of anybody that I would even talk to about stepping into that senior advisor role at that level with that kind of gravitas. And yet in my life that entire time was our next speaker, Rick Santorum. And Rick and I knew each other not politically, not professionally. We had a mutual friend by the name of Foster Freese, a huge philanthropist, and he used to like to take his friends hunting and fishing. And so I met Rick as a hunter and a fisherman. We would fish together up in Canada for salmon. We would hunt pheasant in South Dakota together. And so I knew about his family. I knew him as a friend and a good man, but I never thought of him as a politician or a person that I would know professionally. And then Rick worked for CNN. A lot of you saw him on CNN. A lot of people wondered, why would he work on CNN, a good conservative guy like that? I think it's fantastic. Point of the spear, right in the heart of the beast. I loved it. Ultimately, Rick got canceled by CNN for saying conservative things. Shocking from a conservative, right? For being true to who he was, even though he was at CNN. You see these so-called Republicans or conservatives on CNN or MSNBC or whatever. Generally, they're not really Republicans, not really conservatives. That's not Rick. And so Rick called me one day and said, I'm done at CNN. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. What do you think I should do? And all of a sudden I thought, well, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of it? How about Convention of States, right? He's a man with the stature, the gravitas, the history, the presidential runs, being a senator, all the stuff. America knows him and loves him. And so we talked about it, and he'll tell you a little bit about that process. And so he came to COS. The thing that I want you to know about Rick that's much more important than the presidential runs, than being a senator, than being a true blue conservative, which he is and has always been, is what a good man he is. You know, you see people on stage, you see people in politics, they achieve things and they achieve great things, and Rick has achieved great things. And you think, okay, so that's a great person, that's a person who has achieved greatness. What we often don't know is what's behind the greatness. And unfortunately, often what's behind the greatness is something that's not so great, right? Is that it's the ego, it's the hubris that comes with achieving these levels of success. The most important thing that I can tell you about Rick Santorum is he is one of the best men I've ever met. He is a great man who is also a good man, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to my good friend, Rick Santorum.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. That's overly generous, Mark. Thank you, and it's great to be here with you. I'll pick up where Mark left off, which is how did I get to COS? I did call Mark and asked him, what should I be doing? Where do you think I'm at the highest and best use? Because I've been in the conservative vineyard for a long, long time. I got elected to Congress back in 1990 and was part of the group called the Gang of Seven, and we exposed the House banking scandal and check writing and all this stuff that was going on within the in the Congress, and led to the Republican Revolution in 1994, which was the first time Republicans controlled Congress in 40 years, and came to the Senate and did welfare reform and talked on and led on the issue of abortion and marriage and a whole bunch of other controversial stuff. I was, in a sense, the conservative warrior that was out there trying to get a lot of stuff done. And back in those days, you could actually get some things done. So for me, it was always, what could I do next? Even after I lost for the United States Senate in a horrible election year, 2006, I lost by the largest margin of any incumbent senator in 30 years. And I always have to say thanks to Blanche Lincoln from Arkansas, because several years later, she lost by more than me. Otherwise, I'd still have that record. And so So what did I do after 2006? Well, 4 years later, I decided I'd run for president of the United States. I mean, after you lose by 18 points, what should you do? And I became, as it turned out, I became the conservative alternative to Mitt Romney, and darn near, I won 11 states and darn near won that primary, even though I was outspent about 6-1 in that primary. Why? Because I had a very focused conservative message that we had to get government smaller, that we had to return to the family. I wrote a book in the early 2000s called It Takes a Family. After I ran and almost won, I wrote another book called Blue Collar Conservative. Because my campaign in 2012 was about all the things that you need to do to reform a Republican or conservative coalition around blue-collar workers. And by the way, the person who, I was on a radio show, and a person called me after hearing me on this radio show and said, hey, come up and see me. I want to talk to you about this book. And I did, and I talked to him, and he said, I'm thinking about running for president, and this is the book I'm going to use as my background. And I said, yeah, you'll never run, Donald. And... So he did, and so I feel like I've always been at the tip of the spear of the conservative movement. And so when I called Mark and he said, hey, have you thought about convention of states? And I said, yeah, you know what, I'm not even sure I'm for convention of states. I hadn't really thought about it. And again, I'm on the federal level. I've been a senator, running for president, not really something that was on my radar screen. And he said, well, you should look at it. I mean, because you're all about trying to fundamentally transform the country. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I've been giving speeches across the country talking about how we need structural reform. That because of my experience, things have happened in Washington that the Constitution we know and love no longer is that Constitution. So I'm giving this speech across the country. I was at the Western Conservative Summit, CPAC, others, talking about how we needed to have structural reform within our Constitution. And then Mark hits me with this. So it was a God thing all over it. And the more I read about convention, the state said, why didn't I not know about this? But there's a point to this. And the point is, look, I'm a swamp creature. I've been in Washington, in and around Washington, and national politics for 30 years. And I had no idea of what convention of states really was. And I share that with you because I know a lot of you run into this issue, which is, I talk to people and they don't know nobody seems to know about what convention of states is. And that just tells you that we have so much potential out there. I know you're frustrated by that. I get frustrated by that. I go to state legislatures like going to Pennsylvania, and most members don't know much about it. That's going to start changing. I'm just trying to let you know that's going to start changing. Why? Success. The fact that we're at 19, what we've seen over the past few months, is the left is starting to recognize that we're getting close. We're getting closer to the target. If we can pick up Ohio here in the lame duck session this year and get to 20, right? So we're now getting closer. You get that squiggly line in the front? That squiggly line in the front is really important. Getting to 20 is going to make a big difference because all of a sudden the national media can't ignore us, and they won't. Right now they've successfully ignored us. They thought, look, when I ran for president, I couldn't get on national TV. That's how they kill conservatives. You think they kill conservatives by going after us? No, they kill you by not covering your issues. That's the real power of the media, is what they don't print. It's not what they do print. It's what they ignore. And they've been ignoring us. But pretty soon they're going to not ignore us. And you think you had it hard before when they ignored us? You wait. Okay? They're going to start coming after us as a movement. And so we have our work cut as hard as you think our work is now. It's going to get that much harder, and we have to be that much better and that much more organized to be successful. And so that's the first message I want to communicate to you, which is things are going to start to get harder, and we're going to have to start to get better at our communications and particularly in the states that we need to accomplish to get to 34. And here's the exciting thing. We're at 31 state legislatures right now. Everyone thinks, I talk to people in Washington and conservative groups, and I'm trying to work that group a little bit, and they say, well, it may be a good idea, but you have no chance of getting this done. And I said, well, you're right, the country's really divided. But you know what's really not divided is the states. The states actually, they know that you have a handful of big states that are blue states, that's how Democrats win elections and control things in the Congress. But the reality is that most states are not blue. And increasingly so, particularly thanks to Joe Biden, we have an opportunity not just to get where we are at 31. No, don't ever applaud Joe Biden. And even if I'm being critical, don't applaud him. So we can get to, with Minnesota this year, to 32, or maybe another state like a Colorado or Washington or something like get to 33, and then next year we got elections in Virginia, and we can get to 34, and all of a sudden we'd be in a situation where all we have to do is get all the Republicans to vote yes, and we don't have a convention in 10 years or 100 years, as Mark said. We have a convention in a year or two. So this is, the reason the left is paying attention is because they see this as real. And now we have to start behaving like it's real. So a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Number one is working with legislators. Now, I'm someone who was a legislator. I was a senator for 12 years, a congressman for 4 years. And here's what I want to tell you. Legislators are people too. Okay? By the way, how many legislators do we have? If you're a legislator, stand up here. Anybody out there a legislator? I know we've at least got a couple. There's one. Tom. All right, we got 2. All right, 3. Okay. These are your heroes. Number one, they're here, right? And they're willing to lead. And so we need to make these folks your best friends. And that has to be in every state. I know most of you are conservative grassroots activists, which means, by and large, you distrust and hate the people in power. Am I wrong? Right? They're worthless, they're rhinos, whatever, you call them whatever you want. The problem is, you need them. Okay? And the reality is, I don't know too many, I cut my teeth when I was a kid in the state legislature. I was a staff person there. I don't know any state legislator who goes there to become rich, famous, and powerful. That's not where you become rich, and that's not where you become really powerful. You go to Washington for that these days. Most legislatures are there just trying to do what's best for their community and their state. Now, not all of them, but the vast majority. And they're part-time, and they have jobs, and they have other things going on, and they just want to do the best they can and keep it simple. What they really need, what you really want, if you want to be effective as a leader of conservative states, convention of states, you need to befriend these legislators. You need to be their best friend. You need to be their supporter. You need to be there for them. If you have someone who's a supporter of COS and they don't know you and you're in your community, that's your fault, not theirs. You need to make these people know that you are on their side, you support them, and you are there for them when they need you, not when you need them. It's like any friendship. What kind of friend is just there when they're doing things for you? That's not what friendship is. And believe it or not, these legislators respond to human interaction. Right? And so I know that there's this attitude that this is the enemy, that they're the enemy because they did this wrong or they did that wrong. Well, yes, they probably did. They probably had some bad votes, but you don't care about those votes. I know you do. But when you're here and you're wearing the COS badge, you care about one vote. That's the most important thing that you have to remember. Because I know you're all activists and you're concerned about lots of different votes. You're concerned about election reform. You're concerned about pro-life. You're concerned about all these things. All good things. You need to be. But there's nothing more important than you're doing, and that's why you're here, than getting this resolution passed in your state. Because this is a moment in time when our country is at stake, and the only thing we can do to save the division that's happening in this country is federalism, and the only hope for that is Convention of States. So I'm not saying you shouldn't work on pro-life issues or Second Amendment issues or other issues that you're concerned about. CRT and transing the kids and all that stuff's important, don't get me wrong. And you may have legislators that, are wrong on those issues. But when you go up there wearing the COS badge, the person that is in our corner needs to have your full support, period. I know that's hard sometimes, but it's really important. If we're going to get this done, we have to build relationships. If your state legislator doesn't know you, if the leader of your effort, let me ask you a question. Those who are in states that haven't passed this bill yet, how many of you, I'm not going to ask for hands because it's not important. How many of you know the sponsor of your bill, actually have a relationship with them, have a relationship with the House member, the Senate member, and the other supporters? If the answer is no, then you got to change that. Because that's the only way we're going to win. We have to be known. We're not, at least at this point, we're not being talked about on the national media a lot, which means they're not going to hear about us from their general interaction in the day. I mean, you all tell me this. You're frustrated that we don't get enough national attention. Again, that's going to change. It's not going to be good, but that's okay. The fact is, if the national media is beating us up, that's a challenge, but it's also a benefit, because conservatives now know that, hey, we're one of them, right? So please, number one thing to do is to start thinking about building relationships with your member of Congress. So that's number one. Number two, you're doing the most important thing, that you're working with legislatures and you need to convince them they're doing the most important thing they will ever do as a state legislator. They were set up in the Constitution of being the check to tyranny in Washington. The founders trusted them above anybody else. They put lots of checks and balances in the Constitution. Some of them have been ripped away. But the fail-safe was the Article 5 state legislators, because they trusted the people closest to the people to check. They knew was coming a tyranny at the federal level. And so you have to convince these members, and you have to have the passion that this is about the survival of our nation. This is about what is the most important thing they will ever do. The most important vote they will ever cast is a vote to restore our republic. Right? People ask me all the time, why are you involved in this? Why are you doing this? I've told you, I think it's the next conservative thing to do. But the reason at my age, and after having been involved in 30 years, that I'm still doing this is one word: guilt. In my time on the national scene, this country has gone to hell in a handbasket. I mean, you think about where we were 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan was president. And think of what the culture looks like now, what the debt and the size of the federal government looks like now. And as I look around this room, I see mostly folks who have the same color hair I have. And that means all of us had this happen on our watch. Many of you have parents who were part of the greatest generation. What made them the greatest generation? Were they really better than us? Well, maybe they were. But here's what made them the greatest generation. They had an existential challenge to the future of Western civilization, and they rose to the occasion and met it and won. And they were willing to make the sacrifices. Hundreds of thousands of young men and women died during that conflict. They were willing to do whatever it took to save freedom in our republic. That's what made them great. They met the challenge of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just be honest. We have not met the challenge of the day. We are letting this country, the greatest country in the history of the world, become a tyrannical, sick culture. Washington has become tyrannical, and our culture, as Billy Graham famously said, if God doesn't punish what's happening here in the United States, then he owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Amen? That's us. We let this happen under what you can say, well, no, Senator, I did this, and I tried this, and I worked hard on this. You know what? I'm someone that doesn't give good marks for participation trophies. I'm not interested in how hard you tried. I'm interested in what we accomplish. And let's be honest, we've failed America. I don't know about you. I don't want to be the generation that history looks back on and says, these people lost the greatest experiment in freedom and democracy in the history of the world. We did. No, don't applaud that. Don't applaud that. We need to own that. We need to own the fact that it was on our watch that our country began to fail, is on a path to destruction. And the question is, can we take this generation that has failed America and become the greatest generation that saved America? And I believe in my heart and soul that at the core of that is this movement. And here's the real challenge to you. I know a lot of you come up and talk to me about, all these people aren't even aware of what's going on. They don't even realize what COS is and how bad things are. Here's the issue. You do. You know how bad it is. You know what's in store for America. And that's a burden that you now have been given by God to carry. And that means, and I always say this is one of my favorite lines in the Bible, too much is given, much is expected. Too more is given, more is required. There's no generation in the history of the world that's been given more than ours. We have things like this that 20 years ago was a supercomputer. And there was one of in the world. Now we carry them around in our pockets. We have money, we have food, we have technology, we have every creature comfort. When those lines are written in the Bible, rich people would be considered the poorest of the poor in America today. We are the wealthiest. We have been given the most, which means we have the highest burden to deliver. You are here at this event, and you are involved in this movement because you have been chosen. Yes, you can say, well, I signed up. No, I don't believe anything is I signed up. The Lord motivated you to do what you're doing and called you to be here. And the question is, are you going to do whatever it takes? The left wins because they are willing to do whatever it takes to win. Now, we won't do whatever it takes because we're only going to do good things to whatever it takes, not corrupt things. But the question is, are you willing to make the sacrifice? And here's what I will tell you. From my experience in working lots of issues over a long time, if you are faithful, God will be faithful. So I ask each and every one of you to make the real commitment. The commitment that this country needs of a great generation to save our land and return our country to the republic it can be again. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.
All right, you're going to sit on that side. You see why I fell in love with Rick Santorum? So Rick, you know, what I want to do is, and I talked a little bit about this when I introduced you, is people know you from this kind of stuff, and they see you give inspiring speeches, and they've seen you on television, they watched you running for president all over the country. This morning, it was so interesting to me because I was sitting backstage going through run of show and getting ready, and Jackson, who heads our intern program, came back and he said, man, Rick Santorum's just out there walking around hanging out with people, and I said, well, that's the real Rick. Like, that's what he loves to do. He's just one of us. And I think that makes you unusual as a national political figure, right? Because you see all these national political figures and they get all the fame and they're surrounded by staff and they start to be separated from the people. So that never, for whatever reason, that never went to your head. So I want to dig in a little bit. Tell our folks a little bit about where you were raised and what your family was like, so they get a little bit of where you come from.
My father was an immigrant to this country. He was came over from Italy when he was a boy. My grandfather came from northern Italy. He was anti-fascist. Mussolini came into power, so he left, ended up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania as a coal miner. He mined coal for 50 years until he was almost 70 years of age. Grew up in a company town, so, you know, 2-room house with a dirt floor. So that more than anybody else, my mom's family was an immigrant family too. They one generation away. My grandfather was the first born in this country, also from Italy. And so it was and my parents met after the war. My dad was in World War II, and they met after the war, both working for the Veterans Administration. So I actually spent the first 18 years of my life in public housing, if you will, but I lived on the grounds of a Veterans Administration. And it was I guess a unique upbringing, somewhat like an Army brat in some respects. We moved from VA to VA around, and but I grew up with a deep, great reverence and respect for veterans, particularly because when I was in my formative years in the 70s, veterans were a dirty word. I remember, you know, watching TV and seeing all these protests and how they were, you know, being horrible to our men and women in uniform, and then you know, opening up my front door and seeing these veterans who, you know, sacrificed so much and are struggling so much with whether it was, you know, physical ailments or mental health ailments. And people say, how did you become a conservative? I said, I didn't become a conservative. I just knew I didn't want to be like these people on the left who didn't respect our veterans. And that sort of was sort of formative for me. And to me, that was a window into the left-right movement of this country. And so anyway, I also, obviously my parents worked for the government. I didn't see government as a bad thing. I saw them as trying to help people. And so I came at it a little different than most conservatives did, which is I saw government as something that could be a force for good. And that it wasn't, while I loved Ronald Reagan and supported him, I didn't necessarily see government as the problem. Now, having said that, once I got involved in politics, I started to change my opinion. and I saw government as more of a problem than a solution, because we went way beyond the bounds of anything that we considered to be constitutional government. But that's how I sort of got into it, and felt that I was being called into somehow serving the country.
Did you grow up in a big family?
I had a brother and a sister. My mom and dad, because of the war, got married later in life. They were in their 30s, which was old to get married back in the 1950s. My mother was darn near 40 years old when I was born, which was ancient back then. And so it was we were a small family. Like I said, we were not political. I don't think my father ever voted when I was a kid, and he felt it was, you know, he didn't want to be involved in politics. And And my mom, I think she voted, but I don't really know what party she was. So it was sort of a strange atmosphere, but it was one that allowed me to make some decisions, and I'm happy I made them.
So you have in a way, a famous public family. I mean, you've been a guy that stood for the family for so long, and so that's kind of brought a little bit your family into the public eye. Tell us a little bit about your family.
So Karen and I were married 2 weeks after the primary in 1990 when I was running for Congress for the first time. We got pregnant 3 months later, got elected a month after that, and then started serving in Congress. So it was a big deal. My life has always been, and married life has always been in public life, and we tried to balance the public life and the family, and we did so primarily through just putting the family first and making sure that everything was as good as it possibly could be to weather the storms that were coming. And so we homeschooled our kids. We believed, this was back in the 90s when very, very few people homeschooled, and it was considered really weird. And it was an election issue. I mean, I was criticized for homeschooling my kids, but it's the greatest thing we ever did. Recommend it to everybody. I mean, everybody. That it's I have relationships with my kids because we were involved in forming them in their faith and in their morality and their ethics, and yeah, we cared about academics, but that was fourth or fifth in our line. Academics, you can pick those up along the way. You're not going to pick up the ethical and moral and values and spiritual values along the way in this country anymore. There's plenty of opportunities with our little computers and everything to gain knowledge and information, but to form children to be prepared for the hostile world that is America today and is Western civilization today needs a lot more effort on the part of moms and dads. And I think that's the thing. We're again, part of the greatest generation is, we didn't, the greatest generation thought that the culture would do for their children what it did for them, but it's not the same culture. And I think one of the reasons that the boomers and everybody sort of fell apart and America fell apart is because they trusted their children to the culture. That is suicidal or homicidal in the case of parents to do that to your children today. And so it's harder to be a parent today. It's a lot more work, but there's nothing, and you know this, but there's nothing, no more important thing you can do than protecting the souls of your children. I always tell people that we had 8 children, and I didn't get married till I was 32. We had our last child when I was 50, and my wife was 48. So go there, and so it was one of those things. We were just open. We believe that the greatest thing you can do in your life, the only thing you do in your life, it's true, the only thing you do in your life that lasts, the only thing you do that is eternal is working and cooperating with God to create an eternal soul. Everything else goes away. So you want to make a difference in the world, then leave the world with good souls that can make a better world. And so that's a lesson that we don't tell our children and we don't tell our grandchildren how important that the family is, but it is the most important. It's most important. That's why I wrote a book called It Takes a Family. Hillary Clinton wrote a book back in the late 90s called It Takes a Village, and so I wrote a response. And she was in the Senate at the time.
Only one of you was right, by the way.
Yeah, but I said, that conservatives have to focus on family policy. We have to focus on building stronger families. And I think we've seen the consequences of not doing that, and I think it's another important part of the conservative movement.
So you have 8 kids, and all miracles, because every kid is a miracle.
Yeah.
But you have one kid that is actually famous, and probably
we wrote a book about her.
Yeah, that you probably never expected to be the famous kid. Can you talk a little bit about Bella?
Yeah, when I was 50, we had a little girl named Isabella Maria, and she was born, we found out after she was born, with a condition called trisomy 18. You've probably heard of trisomy 21. That's called Down syndrome. And that's a child born with an extra 21st chromosome. And so having that extra chromosome disrupts the development in the womb and has certain characteristics that you are now familiar with. Everybody knows a Down syndrome kid. Although if you live in Iceland, they have eliminated Down syndrome. They're very proud of that, and which means they kill all the Down syndrome children in the womb, but they said they've ridded themselves of Down syndrome. If you ever met a Down syndrome child, you probably know what they call in the Down syndrome world, they have an extra chromosome, and they call it the love chromosome because they're the sweetest, most wonderful children, but to a world that is utilitarian, they see Down syndrome as a burden. I see it as a gift from God. And our daughter has trisomy 18, which is a much, much more severe genetic defect. 90% of kids who have trisomy 18 die at or before birth. Of those that survive, 90% die within the first few months. And Bella beat all the odds. And I always say, we did a great job as parents, but Bella has been the greatest gift our family's had. Having a child with special needs in a family can tear a family apart. In fact, most families, it does tear them apart. We were very blessed that we accepted the burden. Life is about struggle. It's about burden. I don't know if you've read the Bible, but if you have, show me all the passages where God promised an easy life. None. He promised struggle. He didn't say, pick up your box of chocolates and follow me. He said, pick up your cross. It says before he was crucified, he said, pick up your cross and follow me. And so we were blessed because, we're strong believers. We were blessed in thinking that, every child's a blessing. So we accepted Bella. It was hard. I mean, she can't walk, she can't talk, she can't, she gets fed by a G-tube, doesn't anything. She's a permanent 6-month-old. And so she needs complete, total care. And it's been the greatest blessing. We wrote a book called Bella's Gift. And we wrote 18 chapters. Karen and I decided we were going to write the book together. And then after an hour sitting there writing the book together, we decided that wasn't going to work.
Because you have a normal marriage.
Yes, we have a normal marriage. And so we decided 18 chapters that she would write half and I would write half. So we'd divide the chapters. So she wrote 11 chapters, I wrote 7. And
appropriately divided in a normal marriage.
Well, I mean, women have more to say than men, so it works out that way. And every chapter begins with love is. Because Bella, we always say Bella's our teacher. She teaches us what love is. And because you love by giving. That's how you love. And by the way, that's the key to happiness. That's what we found. And so we wrote this book, and I'll give you one example. I mean, so many profound things that happened with Bella, but one was standing over her bed and just seeing her and realizing that, she'd never be able to make me a coffee or be able to do anything for me. That she is totally dependent. She has nothing. She has no ability to do anything for me. Yet, when I looked at her, I knew, and she displays all the time how much she loves me. And I sat there and I thought, that's how the Lord looks at me. I can do nothing for him. I am completely disabled compared to him. And all he wants from me is to love him. And so Bella is... So Bella has been the great teacher. People have said that when I was in politics, Bella was born after I left the Senate, that I've mellowed since I was in politics, and that's true. Part of it is age, but I think a big part of it is my daughter, and I think it's been for the best.
So now you're at the point where you're having grandkids, and about a year ago, they're all miraculous, but a miraculous grandchild came into your life. Can you tell the story of Zoe?
Yeah, so one of the things I realized is that God, as I said before, if you're faithful, God will be faithful. And my daughter has been married 5 years, and last year, they've been trying to have a child, and they haven't been able to have a child. And so they went and we're Catholic, and so she prayed and prayed and prayed and went on a pilgrimage and to her favorite saint. Her saint is Saint Therese of Lisieux, and so she again prayed. She said, "Look, if you somehow give us a child, I'll name the child after your mom or your dad." And so that was sort of the framework. And so she gets a call on October 1st from a friend of hers who's at church in a mass. And the priest at the end of mass got up and said, "Hey, there's a woman in our community who's decided to give her child up for adoption. She's due in 2 weeks. And there's a chance that the child may have some genetic issues. There's nothing in the sonogram. Everything looks normal, but there's some potential genetic abnormalities." And so this woman, who happens to be a friend of my daughter's, calls her from the back of the church and says, "Hey, this is what's going on." And the priest was there, and she said, "You need to talk to my friend." So the priest gets on the phone with her, and long story short, within a couple days, she has a meeting with the mom, and in Maryland. And so she goes up and meets her, and then the mom sits across her and says, "Well, tells her story. She's married. She has a 4-year-old, but not sure that she's capable of handling any child that has any special needs. They're not doing well financially, and they've got some issues in the home, and all this kind of stuff." And so Elizabeth says, "Okay, that's great." She said, "In fact, I actually contemplated having an abortion." And she pulls out her phone and hands her phone to Liz. It's like an iPhone 6. She says, "This phone does crazy things sometimes." And shortly after I'd found out that I was pregnant, and we were going through this, I pulled out my phone, and the phone had called somebody. And by the time I realized that the phone had called somebody, the person had picked up the phone, and it was a priest. And I didn't even know I had the priest in the contact. I hadn't talked to the priest in 4 or 5 years, but it called this priest. And so I picked up the phone, and she said, "Father, my phone called you by mistake, but maybe I'm supposed to talk to you." And so she talked to the priest, and the priest connected her to a crisis pregnancy center. And the crisis pregnancy center works with a group of nuns in Washington, D.C. called the Sisters of Life. And so they connect to the Sisters of Life, and they start counseling her. And she said that, that the sister that she talked to wanted to send her a book. And so she sent her a book. And said, "What's the book?" She said, "Bella's Gift." And Elizabeth's like, "Oh, okay." She said, "Did you read the book?" And she said, "Well, it was a really trying time for me, so I read the introduction. And I was just so moved. I decided at that point that I wasn't going to have an abortion." And Elizabeth said, "Well, you should know a couple things. First off, that book is about my sister. And that while my parents wrote the book, I wrote the introduction." And the mom said, and she said, "Well, you should know that I didn't read the whole book, as I told you, but I keep the book at my bedside. And it's still at my bedside. And every night before I go to bed, I look at that book, and I look at your mom and dad, and I say a prayer that whoever adopts my little girl will love her as much as they love Bella." And Elizabeth says, "Well, you should know one other thing. The sister that you talked to, could that have been Sister Mary Doolittle?" And the mom says, "Well, yes, it was." She said, "How would you know?" She said, "Well, 5 months ago, I was at a conference with Sister Mary Doolittle. And she's someone who I've gotten to know over the years, and she talked to me about a couple that she was counseling, a woman she was counseling who had a child that might have some issues, and that she told me that she sent her a book the book, Bella's Gift. And then she asked me to pray for that woman and the little girl. So I've been praying for you and your daughter for the last 5 months. And so she saw that as, and she does to this day, that this little girl was meant for our family. And interesting thing, I told you that she prayed to St. Therese of Lisieux. Well, the feast day of St. Therese of Lisieux in the Catholic calendar is October 1st, which is the day she got the call. And so we are very, very blessed. And I always tell this story that I told this story to a friend of mine, and his immediate response was, "I just bought a white pickup truck." And I said, "Okay." He said, "You know what I found out?" I said, "No, what did you find out?" He said, "Everywhere I go, I see white pickup trucks." Did you realize how many white pickup trucks there are out there in America? When you drive around, there are white pickup trucks everywhere. And I said, "Okay." He said, "It's like God. Until you experience God, you don't realize He's everywhere." And so, and this is what I keep coming back to. Zelly was a little girl like our Bella who had some disabilities. She was a little girl that was going to be aborted. I spent 30 years of my life working on the disabled and to save children from abortion. And God just said, "Thank you." God will be faithful. If there's any message I can leave to you as you take on what seems to be an impossible challenge to save the nation that He loved the most, if you are faithful, so will He be. God bless you.
Rick Santorum.
I just couldn't sit by anymore and do nothing.
I always said I hated politics, but I found out that you can't really change things if you don't get involved.
What we're looking for is somebody that has the heart and wants to help save their country.
It's just the nicest group of people that